In this video tutorial, I'll explore how to create custom halftone effects for use in screen printing or to digitally simulate a kind of screen printing style. And I think halftones are super cool, and there's lots of creative custom effects that you can make with them, and that's what we'll explore here. If you're unfamiliar with halftones, really they're patterns of dots or lines or other shapes that vary in size or spacing to create the illusion of different shades or tones. So for example, in this image, the lines get thinner in the highlights and sort of thicker in the shadows. Similarly, if we were using dots, smaller dots that are sort of looser would be in the highlights, or larger dots that are more densely packed might be in the shadows. So let's get started exploring this and making our own custom halftones. And to do that, we really need two things. We need an image, and I found this image on Unsplash, and we need a pattern. I've created a pattern already. I'm going to go ahead and place it in the image using my File, Place, Embedded, and I've got this lines pattern that I'm simply going to place on top. It's just a series of lines, and that's perfect. So black lines. All right, so really what we're going to do is composite the lines together with the image, and we're going to be using threshold because halftone printing uses a single ink color, so we really just need black or white. So I'm going to start by applying threshold to the image. I'll do that through the adjustments and add the threshold. And you can see what happens. We're sort of interacting the line with the textures of the image here, or the shadows and highlights of the image, but it's not very interesting. I could readjust, how much threshold to get sort of more line or more of the shadows of the image. Now, part of the reason it's not very interesting is we don't have any thickness or thinness to the lines. They're all the same, and that's because the lines that I used all have really hard edges on them. The magic of creating our own custom halftone effects is actually to sort of have some level of transparency or blurring on the lines so that they interact with the image below a little bit better. So what I'm going to do is make sure that my lines layer is a smart object. I'm going to right click, convert it to a smart object in case it's not, so that I can apply filters non-destructively. Then I'll go under my filter effects and choose a Gaussian blur on those lines. Once we apply that blur, you'll see that right away our halftone is starting to change, and we can adjust the amount of the blur and get sort of varying different sort of effects. And it is that blurring that sort of creates the sort of magic of our halftone here. So depending on how much blur I've got on the line, we'll get sort of differing kind of halftone effects. I'll click OK. Because that's a smart object, I'll be able to change that blurring later. And under the threshold, I could certainly adjust the amount of threshold in order to sort of change the look of this to get kind of the style that I want for it. In addition to adjusting the threshold, I might adjust the tonal range on the image. And you can do that in a couple of ways. I like to use levels or curves. And so I'm going to go ahead and apply a levels adjustment. And you'll see that if I add contrast to the image, that's going to sort of change how the sort of the thickness or thinness of the lines and where they're applied, as well as my output levels, can adjust sort of the thickness and thinness of the lines. And as I play with these things, we're going to get varying sort of halftone effects. There certainly might be places in your image, such as here where the eyelashes are, where you're not necessarily just getting sort of the look of the lines, because we're still interacting with the image that's below. But if your image underneath is also a smart object, you might apply some blur to it as well. If I add a Gaussian blur to the image, you'll see it sort of simplifies the image. If you oversimplify it, you might lose some of the detail that you want or the sort of nature of the image. But if I blur it a little bit, some of the actual little details might blend together a little bit better with your lines, and you'll create the effect that you're looking for. This is the basics to creating your own custom halftones inside of Photoshop. You start with a threshold layer on top, you get your pattern underneath that, and you apply some level of blurring to that pattern so that it interacts with the images that are below. Then you have your image that's below, which you might adjust with some sort of tonal range adjustment, such as levels or curves. Now this might be enough to get you started if you want to play on your own, but if you want to get a little bit more into the theory of how this works or why it works, and also how to create your own custom patterns, then keep listening. Keep watching, I should say. All right, so let's get a little bit deeper into this. In order to pull back the curtain on how this is all working and explore some of the theory behind it, I've added this gradient. And let's take a look at how threshold interacts with the gradient. Now, when we create a threshold, we have to move to black and white. So any of these gray halftones or quarter tones or three-quarter tones, they all have to either go to black or white. So when we put on our threshold and we take a look at what's happening with threshold and drag the slider, we'll go either to more of the highlights or more of the shadows, but we really have to choose sort of black or white for all of those things. So those gray pixels have to move one way or the other. How they move is the interesting part. If we add some shapes on top, so I've got these different sort of dots, right? Some of them have a hard edge, some of them have a soft edge that starts to blend with the layer underneath, right? So when I have a sort of soft edge, use a soft edge brush, we get this gradual fade on the edge of the dots. And it is the interaction of that and the layer below that's kind of the interesting part. When we turn on our threshold, those dots got to go one way or the other. And you'll see one of the things that happens is as we push and pull those dots, we can kind of deform them. They sort of interact with the layer below where they actually get a little bit of deformation, which is interesting. They also get either smaller or larger depending on, our sort of tonal range, where we're pushing the threshold and what the sort of tones are. So it is in that interplay, that deformation, that we're sort of operating here. Okay, knowing that, I'm going to throw those layers away and let's go ahead and explore making our own custom patterns. Now, we could start right within the filter effects inside of Photoshop. So Photoshop has different filter effects and you can apply them directly on an image, or you could apply them, so I'm going to take everything else off and just apply them directly to the image, or I could apply them to a layer above, which is my preference, and I'll show you that and why in just a minute. So under the filter gallery, I could apply, provided I have a smart object, and I do of my image, then I'll act non-destructively. I could apply halftone effects, and you'll find the halftone filter effect under the sketch folder, and it's called halftone pattern, where we can sort of change the size of the dots, we can change the contrast on those dots, and we could change what type it is, like whether we wanted lines or circles or dots. So if I apply that to the image, you'll see that it applied it, except it looks like it's inverted. And that's partly because, or it is because, I've got a foreground background color here of white to start with and black as the background color. So it uses those colors when it applies the dots. And if you had color there, you'll see that color applied. I'm going to undo that filter gallery and swap the foreground background color so that the black is on top as the foreground. And then when I reapply that filter gallery and we add the halftone pattern, you'll see that it actually is doing it as if it's not inverted now. So these colors matter when you're applying that. So we could apply this pattern directly to the image, and it's still getting a lot of grayscale with that pattern. And of course, if we're working with halftone printing, we use a single ink color. So we would still need to turn our threshold on, and we're starting to get a little bit of the sort of interaction with those dots and those patterns. It's not exactly what I want, but we can always come back to that filter gallery and edit that further if we wanted like a larger dot size or those kinds of things. We could bring that in. Now, I don't necessarily like to apply the filter gallery directly to the image in that way if I'm working with halftone. Instead of that, what I might do is actually apply it to a layer on top. So what I'll do is add a solid color layer on top. Oops, not a gradient, but a solid color. And I'm just going to choose a neutral gray. And so if the brightness is 50%, or the RGB values are all 128, we get that sort of neutral midpoint gray. I'm going to add that, and I'm going to convert that into a smart object to act non-destructively on it. And then what I'll do is I'll apply the filter gallery filter and actually apply in the sketch folder, the halftone pattern to that gray. And I'm going to have a high contrast dot, as high as I can get, and a little bit larger size dot here in this particular case. Let's go ahead and apply that. And it just fills that layer with those dots. Now, if I wanted this to sort of interact with the layer that is below, I could do that now. If I go ahead and turn on my threshold, nothing happens. But if I wanted to interact with the layer below, I could change the blending mode to something such as like color burn, for example. And then we burn that in. Now, the image that's underneath needs to be a black and white image in this case. So you can see that I'm just sort of applying those dots. Might be interesting in and of itself, but I want that to be on a black and white image. So I'm going to go ahead and add a black and white filter to my image. Okay, now that we've got that, we could go ahead and apply the threshold to this and then readjust the sort of threshold based on that. Now, this works, but the reason that it's not interesting is those dots aren't blurred out, so the interaction is somewhat limited. So on the pattern itself, that color fill of the filter gallery, what we're going to do is apply a blur to that. So I'm going to say Gaussian blur, and then add quite a bit of blur to the actual dots. And so as they blur out, we're going to get dots of varying sizes, and that could be potentially quite interesting here. So I'm going to go ahead and say 8 in terms of the amount of blur. And then what we can do is adjust the threshold. If this is now a little bit too dark, I can sort of readjust the threshold to get some varying styles. And so not only might I apply some different styles here, but I could also adjust the effects on the image itself. And so I want to apply some tonal range adjustments. Now I could do that through levels or through curves. This time I'll do it through curves. And what we can do is add some contrast here, or we can change the output levels. And depending on how close together or far apart these are, our dots are going to get bigger or smaller. We're going to sort of have different dots in different places, you know, depending on what we want to do with this. So we can readjust this to kind of get into the space that we want. So maybe I like this for one thing, but I could sort of mix different sort of tonal ranges together. So sometimes I'll use masking to have some areas that are darker and some that are lighter, and then kind of mix and match. I'll do that in a minute, but let's go ahead and explore creating some of our own custom patterns instead of just relying on the halftones that are inside of Photoshop. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that particular layer off, and instead and I can turn everything off here, we'll add some of our own custom patterns. Now we could build patterns right inside of Photoshop. The way that you might do that is you can go to your tools here. I'm going to just create a very like a small dot here. So let's say it was maybe 30 pixels, and I just make a dot. I'm going to convert that dot into a smart object, and then double click on the smart object to get in the editing mode of just the smart object itself. And you can see what that looks like. And what I want to know is what that's going to look like as a pattern. So under the view menu, I could choose pattern preview to see what that's going to look like as it replicates itself as a pattern. If I like that, I'm going to add it to my pattern library. So I've got my pattern panel open. If you don't, you can go under Window, Patterns to open that up. But then what I'll do is hit plus to add that to the library. And I'm kind of done with my smart object now that I've got that as a pattern. I can get rid of that layer altogether, don't really need that one anymore, but I'll make a new layer for the pattern and simply apply the pattern by double clicking on it, or clicking once on it really. Okay, so now that that pattern's on there, I could apply it to the image with sort of threshold in this case, right? The cool thing about having it as a pattern fill is that we can adjust the size. If I double click on the pattern, we can get the pattern fill options, and I can adjust like the angle of the pattern. I can adjust the size and scale of the pattern to get different sort of effects to that depending on what I want with it. Now that I've got that as a pattern, let's apply it to our actual image. I'm going to turn sort of thresholding on. We'll take a look at the threshold and sort of readjust to bring some of the image back. And again, this doesn't look good because the pattern itself has no blur, so the way that it interacts with the image is much more limited. So to add some blur to the pattern, I'm going to start by converting it into a smart object. Right click, convert to smart object, and then we'll go in here and add some Gaussian blur to that. Now, depending on the amount of blur is going to sort of make our adjustments vary. So I'm going to add some level of blur to this, and it seems a little bit dark, but I can go back into my options for threshold, readjust some of the threshold options, and again on my curve sort of readjust some of the curve options as well to sort of see what this looks like and kind of bring things lighter or darker depending on what we want to sort of see with this. So we can readjust this in this way. So we can make our own sort of custom patterns inside of Photoshop to sort of interact with our image, and that can be a fair amount of fun depending on sort of what we want this to look like. Because we've used a pattern fill, we can always edit that. I'm going to double click into the smart object for that pattern, take a look at it, and decide, oh, I don't want it at an angle anymore. I'm going to take the angle off. Maybe I want smaller dots, so I'm going to go 50% scale, and I can click save that back out and then go back to my image, and now I'm sort of reapplying that different sort of pattern on here, and I can make, you know, varying adjustments. So maybe I would sort of really like this, but I want like some of the dots in the background to show up a little bit more, but I want some of the highlights in the face to not necessarily be quite so dark. So one thing that you might think of is sort of mixing and matching your elements together. So for example, what I might do is take sort of all my content, and I'm going to take all of this and group it into a grouped folder by clicking on the folder. Select all the objects, making a group folder. Then I'm going to duplicate that folder. And in the one that's on top, I could have something where I actually vary the threshold, or maybe I vary the sort of curves adjustment on the image itself to have sort of a different look to this particular one. If I turn that off, we can see how that varies, you know, compared to the one that's sort of underneath. And depending on what I want for my image, I could sort of use that and mix and match it with what's underneath. I'll do that by creating a mask on the group and then use my brushes to sort of brush in or out content that I want or don't want here. So for example, maybe I didn't want, like I want this sort of darker on one edge or lighter. I could sort of paint that in. So I'm going to go ahead and sort of mask out so I get sort of lighter elements on this side, and kind of maybe I have some of my own custom highlights that are there. So depending on what I wanted that to look like, we could readjust the patterns here to get sort of effects. So, you know, depending on what you want, that's one of the ways that you can sort of mix different sort of thresholds together. The other thing that you could do is literally just paint sort of underneath the pattern in black and white. So as I'm here, and I'm going to go ahead and just work on this one that's underneath. If I go underneath the pattern and I create a layer and then I use sort of black paint, so let's say I start painting in black, you'll see that I'll paint in black on the image that's underneath, or I'll paint in white on the image that's underneath. And so if I wanted to sort of play around with this, I might use kind of a soft edge brush, and I could sort of play around with, you know, adding some content in here. So depending on how I want this to sort of work, I could sort of play with painting out like some of this. I'm just sort of painting with some white in here, and I could take these dots away by doing that, you know, and sort of readjusting this. And I just really have some painting in white on there and how that might interact with what's below. So you can mask, or sometimes you can just work with paint in that case. So pretty cool. I can make my own custom patterns right within Photoshop, and it can be interesting to do like sort of wacky patterns with this. Like I'm going to go ahead and create one more, and let's say what I did was just go to my brush, and I'm going to make a much smaller brush. Let's say I'll make a nice hard brush to start, but you know, and then what I'm going to do is just do like a wiggly line. Looks kind of crazy. I'll convert that into a smart object. And then with that smart object, I'm going to double click to look at it and see what it looks like as a pattern. I'll say view pattern preview for that. It's a little bit weird, but it can work potentially as a pattern. So I'm going to go ahead and add that as a pattern and then come back. And sometimes it's interesting to see what sort of effects you can get. Now that I've got that as a pattern, I'll return back to my document. I'll create a new layer for that pattern, apply it, and then I'm going to adjust the pattern preview. Let's say I wanted it more like at an angle like that, and maybe I need it quite a bit smaller so that they kind of repeat, right? So I'm going to go ahead and put that in at this kind of crazy angle that's there. I'll convert it into a smart object so I can apply some Gaussian blur to it so it blurs that content out a little bit. And then what we could do is use that sort of custom pattern inside to create sort of shading and highlight, right? So we're using that sort of custom shape that we've made, and that really becomes the kind of shading of the image. And so you can do all kinds of interesting things. Now, I could adjust my pattern so I didn't have the sort of gaps in between, and certainly we could play around with threshold adjustments and those kinds of things as we want to get more or less. So one way we can make our patterns is right within Photoshop. Now, certainly another place we could make patterns is in Illustrator. So if I switch over to Illustrator, I might make my own custom pattern there. I'll create a new file in Illustrator at the size of my print. And let's go ahead and just explore making a simple sort of circle pattern. I'm going to turn off the fill here for that. And I'm going to make I'm just going to make a little circle. I'll push that circle into the center. And then what I'll do is I'll hold Alt to duplicate that, make a second one, and I'm going to make this second one sort of really big, kind of to the edges of the document itself. And maybe I'll center that as well, and then make it a little bit bigger. Okay, now in between these, I could use my blend tool. So I'm going to use this blend tool and sort of click on one, click on the other, and it will create a blend in between as I do this. So it will blend in between the images. You can also use Object, Blend, Make in order to do that. Now the options for our blend, which we could get here under Object, or we could double click on the blend tool, that can specify the number of steps in between our image. So if I wanted like less circles or more circles, I kind of like 50. That sort of works for me here in terms of that. Now you can also adjust the stroke if you wanted a thicker or thinner line, but I kind of like this. So what I'm going to do is export that out at my size. I'll call that circles and just overwrite the one that's in there and say okay. Okay. Now I'll come back to Photoshop to use that pattern inside of Photoshop. So I'm going to get rid of this particular pattern. I'll turn off my threshold for now just to see the image. And then I'm going to create a layer where I'll place that pattern on top. File, place embedded, and that will automatically make this into a smart object as well once I've placed that, and I can put that into the image. So I'll embed that in. And then, of course, I'm going to want to give that a little bit of blur to see what the interaction might look like. Now, I can turn on the threshold now, and we can kind of see what's happening with the lines. But I'm going to give those lines a little bit of blur. So filter Gaussian blur, and the amount of blur is going to have a big effect on sort of what this looks like. I'm going to, in this case, give it maybe about 3 pixels of blur. Now we can turn on our threshold and start to see how those lines might interact with our image. We can see what's happening with the image in that case. So you can create patterns in Photoshop if you know, or Illustrator. You can import those into Photoshop and create some interesting effects. One of the things that's a little bit interesting about this as well is if I go into this, I could sort of warp this. So I'm going to go to the Liquify filter, for example. And let's take a look at the Liquify filter on my circles. And what I can do is just come in here and kind of warp my images a little bit. So these will kind of sort of warp out and get wacky and, sort of some interesting sort of effects. Now, those patterns will all apply back onto the image. So if I wanted something that was a little bit more psychedelic or something, then any of those patterns can apply. Because that Liquify filter is on a smart filter, on a smart object, I could return to the Liquify filter and kind of readjust this at that point. So if I wanted it to be a little bit different, I could come on here and sort of play around with it, add more or less to it to see sort of the differing effects that I might get. If I don't like it, I can always turn that Liquify filter off, which is nice as well. And so now that I have this, I might want to imagine what this would look like printed and what sort of color ink I might want to use. And one of the things that I could do with this is simply apply like a solid color overlay on that. So let's say I was imagining printing this in a kind of sort of dark purple color. I'll go ahead and use that and simply apply the lighten blend mode to see what that looks like on the image. And if I was doing screen printing, I could actually just print this as a transparency now and be able to have that and expose some emulsion on a transparency for my screen and then print with this. And if I wanted to, I could imagine sort of what color I want that ink to be. Or if I'm simulating screen printing digitally, I could go ahead and sort of apply these colors and these effects to creative uses, right? One thing that I might also apply on my my circles here, on my textured lines, is maybe a little bit of noise. If I add a little bit of noise to this, it would maybe simulate a kind of photocopying effect or a printed effect as well. Maybe the lines are just a little too perfect. And so inside the filter gallery, I've got something for film grain, or I could apply some noise through add noise. And we can add just a little bit of noise to the lines. So depending on what they look like, they're going to interact in a sort of different, dirtier way, right, as I add this noise in. So that could be an interesting effect depending on what you're looking for. So that, or maybe film grain through the filter gallery, could add those types of effect to your image. Now, I should mention that beyond creating your own sort of patterns, there's lots of patterns available out there, including sort of patterns that you can download right into Photoshop or images that you can use. And in addition to sort of making patterns, you could also work with images. If I turn the circles off here and created a new layer, just as an example, I might actually place another image that I found on Unsplash, and it's this sort of like undulating sort of circle looking thing here. So I might put that in to the document and take a look at what that might sort of look like within my own image here. So I'll add that in, and if I wanted it to interact with the image, I could maybe do like a little color burn effect on it because it's got white within it, so I need that to sort of burn back down. And then on the image itself, I could apply some sort of filter effects, including some blurring, and that might change sort of how these sort of different dots are sort of interacting with what's going on underneath. So the blurrier they are, the more they might be, the more the image might be affected here. And I do need to sort of adjust my threshold a little bit more to get more or less of what I'm looking for. It's kind of interesting on the image there, but I'm losing some of the background, right? So depending on how you have the threshold set and also what kinds of filter effects you've got on your image, like the tonal range of the image, whether they're curves or whether you're working with like levels adjustments, you could play around with sort of what this looks like. And so as we mess with this, we can bring in smaller or larger dots. We could, bring more or less of these dots back in depending on what we want to see for this. So that can be kind of interesting in terms of how this might sort of interact and work. And again, like maybe I'm not getting the specific effects that I want all in one place. So I might, redo these and add a couple different versions of this. I've done that in the past by grouping these together and then having one version in one group, for example. So like maybe this one is one group, duplicating that group, and then in a different group, adjusting the threshold sort of that further. So maybe I want one where I've got more of the background kind of showing through a little bit. I could adjust it there. I could adjust the sort of filter effects as well. So depending on how much sort of filter I've got on these, they're going to sort of adjust in different ways. So I might take quite a bit of the sort of filter off, and just because these dots already had some gray in them. So maybe I've got some that are there. And so this group is overlaying the one that's on top, right? And so maybe I like the face of this one, but the background of this one. If that's the case, I could add a mask. If I hold down Alt when I add that mask, it will mask everything out. What I could do is then paint with white on that mask in order to bring some of the background back. Now, one thing about this is that I probably need a hard edge brush as I do that. Otherwise, I'll get some weird maybe transitions, but I could bring some of this background back in, see what I like in terms of mixing and matching this together. This is a little odd right there. Maybe I switch back. Now, let's say I had a soft edge brush as I did this, and I kind of like paint this back in. You'll see that it ends up like getting this kind of gradient as we do that. So depending on sort of what I'm masking and how I end up getting this kind of gradient effect here as those are blurring together. And maybe I don't like that gradient. I'm going to switch colors, kind of bring this in. Potentially I don't like the way that gradient looks. I might need to re-threshold this in that case, because the mask itself is, what I could do is pull the color out and then re-threshold the image. And so I'm going to go ahead and threshold it again here, and then which I wanted here, so that the so that there's no gray, because there can't be any gray if we were printing this to sort of a transparency and on our ink. So we could kind of see what that looks like, and it ends up with a very sort of hard edge line there. So ultimately we're going to have a kind of hard edge right there, depending on how we want that sort of shadow to work. But I could like draw in individual dots. I could get a much smaller brush to sort of play with how this can interact. All right, so those are a few ways we might create some creative halftone effects. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and found something useful in it.